I would first of all like to thank everyone for coming, particularly recent graduates and lawyers from downtown who've come across for this evening. I'm delighted to see you all, and it's the sort of event that I'm really glad we can put on. Well, of course, tonight we have a very distinguished guest, Dame Fiona Wood. She's a preeminent energy lawyer in the international arena and a very important public figure. In 2013-2014, she served as the 686th Lord Mayor of London. But remarkably, only the second woman to fill that position since 1189. So almost 2 women per millennium appears to be the standard in that role. Dame Fiona practices law based in London with CMS Cameron McKenna. Her international experience is unparalleled. She's provided legal advice in India, Australia, Asia, the Middle East, Central and Eastern Europe, Russia and Scandinavia. And she's worked in such deeply exotic locations as Cambodia, Mauritius and Ontario. So we're very honoured that she's agreed to speak tonight on a topic that is, as she's discovered today, of rather immense local interest, and the decarbonisation issue. So Dame Fiona, I'd welcome you on behalf of the faculty.
Well, thank you very much. I'm greatly honoured to have been invited. I'm here with an organisation called the Canada-UK Council, and they're here for their annual colloquium, which moves from one province to another. And they finished the day, and I said, I'm off to deliver a talk at the University of Alberta. And they were very impressed, and I felt, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I have to say that it is a great moment to be in Alberta. I mean, this week, how many announcements have we had on the electricity industry and the transition to the low carbon economy? And I think for anybody with an interest in the field who's a lawyer, what a great moment to be on the planet. It doesn't get more interesting and more complex than this. And of course, the great thing is that behind every challenge is an opportunity. And it's an opportunity for us as lawyers to make a contribution. Of course, the thing is about this sector is that we have to be very careful to make sure that we don't think we can rewrite the laws of physics with legal rules. So we have to understand the nitty-gritty of it. And we're working at the cusp between engineering, physics, economics, and law. And the thing that has taken me around the world, you missed out a reference to Latin America and Central America, but there we go, is that everything has to come together in an internally consistent set of legally enforceable rules. And the reason that lawyers now get involved in conversations about objectives, strategy, implementation, market design, which you might have thought was all the province of economists and financiers, financial advisors, is that actually we're the ones that know all the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and how they fit together and how long they take to develop and cook. But let me, I know that I've got a lot to cover this evening, and I don't want to waste any time. I've got more slides than I can speak to and more detail on each slide, but I did prepare them specially for this visit in an effort to leave you with something which you could read after the event. So I'll start moving down the slides so that we have a feel for the low carbon drive that the Paris Agreement, of course, has delivered. I was talking to Caroline Saunders, who was part of our climate diplomatic effort in the run-up to Paris. She actually said, that she had no idea that the Paris Agreement would actually come into force so quickly. So we can celebrate that. And green is indeed great. This is one of our posters. I think that the new climate economy reports, which actually the first one, which of course goes back about 10 years, that Lord Stern wrote about the correlation between reducing carbon and economic growth, is that we know that by addressing climate change, that we can actually achieve all sorts of different benefits at the same time. And that to drop to the bottom line, it's actually in our self-interest, in our economic self-interest, to address emissions reductions, because the benefits are about resource productivity, in other words, doing more with less. So that improves the affordability that we are trying to achieve. And it's also going to deliver all sorts of other benefits, as the black writing indicates. And we are looking at what we've been calling in the UK the trilemma, because everything that we do, everything that we've been trying to do since Kyoto in '92, has been designed to deliver security of supply, affordability, and decarbonisation. Now, the Global Commission recommended 10 transformative actions. Number 10 on that slide says phase out unabated coal fast. It's their list, not mine. But I think the other one that is relevant to you here in Canada is number 4, which is price carbon to send a clear market signal. I think the other one that perhaps we are slowly getting to is number 1, which is integrate climate risk into strategic decisions. Well, the electricity industry, of course, has had to do that now for some time. I'll briefly talk to the introduction of new subsidies and the phasing out of old subsidies. And I'm going to talk about some lessons we've learned from the UK and Europe. And in a moment, I'll get to the one question you all want to ask me is, what do I think about Brexit? Which the answer is not a lot. The UK started with some feed-in tariffs and a system of renewable obligation certificates. And it did get the system going. It did drive investment in some technologies which have really flourished and become completely cost competitive with fossil fuels, and that's solar and onshore wind. We have more solar in the UK than they do in Spain. It's quite remarkable because we don't think of ourselves as a particularly sunny place, but it does operate on light. And it's useful to have. The subsidies were phased out very quickly without much notice, and the industry hated that. And my message to governments was, if you're going to put in subsidies, tell people when you're going to take them off, phase them out, give investors notice. They don't like this sort of thing, and they hate cancellation risk. And so but what we're finding now is that there are new solar arrays being planned every 5 minutes with storage attached, even though there are no subsidies. So investors have stopped taking on the political risk of chasing subsidies, which is a much better place to be, really. Oh, that's curious. I went to the end. That wasn't very clever of me. That's the wrong thing. I may need some help with getting...
You're looking at the wrong source, but we'll see what...
Yeah. I'll have to go backwards. Look where I put my finger in due course. It shows you how many slides we've got. I won't talk to that one. The other big lesson that we've learned from implementing a renewables program, which I'll show you in a moment, really came from the EU. We have a renewables directive that set us targets on the percentage of renewables on the system, which probably I wouldn't recommend to anybody. I think I'd more recommend emissions reductions targets than percentage of renewables on the system. I think even Brussels would say that they wouldn't do that again. But what we have found is that integrating renewables onto the system, particularly in a competitive market, when you haven't got storage in the market very much either, is that you have to have on the system backup. And system operators tend to prefer thermal backup. And indeed, we've been worrying that the National Grid, that's the system and market operator, has actually preferred coal-fired plant because they quite like to keep a bit of coal on the system because they kind of understand coal and they worry about security of supply. System operators are trained to keep the lights on, a bit like doctors, they're trained to save lives. We think that if, and this comes from our new National Infrastructure Commission that really has some very large brains on it, and they produced a report in March saying that what we really need are more interconnections with our neighbours. And this will be a message I'll return to because I think it's very relevant to Canada, which is not heavily interconnected. It's very lightly interconnected from one province to another. It's very interconnected with America, but that's just for export purposes. Storage and demand flexibility. We should be using demand-side response, the ability to withdraw demand from the system in all its various forms as an asset class that can contribute to low-cost flexibility. Now, these three areas are what we are now looking at in terms of incentivizing investment. Perhaps not necessarily with subsidies, but a better level playing field for these asset classes to compete in our competitive markets with other more conventional forms of generation. We also have, if I start talking about ancillary services markets, do you know what I mean? These are services that are supplied to help system operators maintain reliability and to keep frequency around the 50 Hz standard. And many systems have competitive markets in ancillary services and also balancing markets where there's obviously electricity must balance in real time, supply and demand must balance in real time. We need to make course corrections on those markets because in that way we'll reduce the amount of backup and integrate better the renewables that we have in the market. So this is something for the market design to think about that the government has, or market redesign that the government has announced. The government announced the introduction of a capacity market. This enables, it comes about because energy markets don't really give you the sort of price signals sufficiently early for new generation to be built. And your energy-only market here in Alberta is actually in megawatt terms quite small, and it has some very large plant in it that can dominate market prices and operations. So it's hardly surprising that the government has decided that in order to encourage new generation onto the system using different technologies, that it needs one of these markets. This is the sort of stuff that lawyers love working on because it creates a whole plethora of market rules which are highly interactive with the laws of physics and economics. And there are lots and lots of examples of it's quite hard to get it right, and there are all sorts of ways in which they can be designed to favour certain types of technologies with different contract lengths for different types of technology, different lead-in times. And actually what we've found, and sort of the lesson we've learned from the UK, is you need to work very hard to make sure you create a level playing field for all technologies, particularly new ones coming on. So we're kind of disadvantaging storage into our capacity market because we are charging them twice as if they're generation and demand. So level playing field would be the message I'd like you to take away from the capacity market. You will be using contracts for differences. I hadn't a clue what a contract for difference was in 1990 when we started using them. I was representing the national grid in the middle, as my husband said, it was just a little company in the middle. It's not one of the big players, but actually it does everything really between. It's like the Visa card of the industry. So I was rather lucky, wound up writing 700 codes and agreements to make the new market work and to keep the lights on, the first grid code ever. These contracts for differences were purely price hedging instruments at that time, where there was an agreed strike price, and if the market price was below the strike price, then the generator was paid the difference. There can be two ways, so if the market price is higher than the strike price, the generator has to pay the money back, either rebates to consumers or sometimes it goes in the pocket of the government, but it's not always the right thing to do. We've had a successful reinvention of contracts for differences for the procurement of renewables. A couple of years ago, we've had a couple of auction rounds, and it's been segmented auctions. So one segment is for mature technologies, and one segment is for technologies where we'd like to invest more to see whether they can be brought up to scale and develop in terms of their reliability. And they have been successful in driving down the price of mature technologies as well. I think I'll probably skip energy efficiency, largely because I don't think that we've got lots of lessons that are relevant to you. There are a few sort of what not to do. What I think you can take away from this slide is a point I've already made, which is that we've had policy changes on energy efficiency. There was a zero carbon homes policy which got cancelled, and that caused the contraction of 22% of the building insulation industry. So we're not very proud of that. But there was another effort, which I thought was rather good on paper, called the Green Deal, which was loans for insulating homes. And actually what happened was the banks outcompeted the Green Deal. And so it created a new market-based offering. But I think we have to work also with local authorities in terms of the way in which we plan new buildings to make sure that energy efficiency is a requirement of a planning permission. There's good experience from Denmark in dealing with things so that not everybody's doing different things, but everybody's doing the same thing, which creates the economies of scale to make it worth a provider to come in. Now, Carbon pricing. I don't need to tell you that the federal government is holding a kind of sword of Damocles over the provinces, saying if you don't do it, we will do it. But I think and I guess that what I can bring you from my European perspective is that we have actually had a number of different experiences with the emissions trading system. It's a cap and trade mechanism rather than a carbon tax. We think it's the most cost-effective way of pricing carbon and influencing the transition to a lower carbon economy. We know from experience that actually you're better off to auction the initial allowances rather than give them away free. We gave too many away. We know from experience that carbon prices that are too low don't do anything very much. We know that carbon prices that are very high will raise questions about competitiveness. In the UK, we have a hybrid. We have a carbon price floor, which I'll now turn to. If you look at the third bullet, the EU carbon price, I mean, it's around £5.30. But in addition, because of the carbon price floor, UK companies pay another £12.70 to HM Treasury. This has tended to given a competitive advantage to European suppliers of energy who are not paying the extra, which has meant that we have probably imported more from Europe than perhaps we might otherwise have done if we hadn't had this adder in the carbon price floor. It's kind of relevant to you as you think about whether President-elect Trump will introduce carbon pricing in the United States. I mean, I hope that it won't deflect your ambition to join 50% of the world's GDP that is now pricing carbon and is growing. The message, though, that from the UK perspective is that the ETS has worked a lot better because it's part of a regional market, and you will be seeing, of course, that Quebec and California are linking their ETS systems, and Ontario will be joining. So a number of quite complex messages out of that, but the thinking is that actually carbon pricing has taken hold, and that regional markets are developing. You don't have to be locationally proximate to do that, and that ultimately I'm hoping that we'll see a global market. Interconnectors, I'm keeping an eye on the time. You'll tell me when I have to finish. I'm a big fan of electricity interconnectors, but I would be because I live on an island. And they have enabled the UK for decades to import cheaper, cleaner energy into the UK. And when we started the competitive market in 1990, the flow was not just one way, but it was actually two-way as well. And on some days we import as much as a third of our energy, both electricity and gas, across interconnectors. We've got lots of them, and would you believe it, it is economic to build one all the way to Norway. Norway, of course, has cheap hydropower. It's cheaper than buying, than building a power station of comparable size, even though the distances are enormous, and the seabed risk isn't clear. It'll come on stream, I think, early 2018. It's being laid as we speak. It does enable us to export surplus renewable energy when we have it to spare, rather than to spill it, as we get. We don't have sufficient storage capacity yet for that. So it enables us to manage a number of issues all at the same time. And it has always struck me as interesting, as I look at Canada as a whole, that province by province you are relatively small markets, and you don't have an internal market, if you like, between you, because the interconnections are so small. And I gather Alberta imports from BC only about 1% of its energy, and yet the BC ratepayer has paid for some really very, very smart hydro facilities one way and another, and it looked like a sort of no-brainer for thinking about expanding the import capacity there. And we might have to build the associated transition, but I hear your transmission system is strong, and if it's perhaps not all in the right place, but it never is. That's the national bit. But if you take away a message from that side, I'm a fan of interconnectors, one way and another. Brexit is a hurdle, not largely because EU regulations, which have direct effect without having to be passed into domestic law, regulate access to interconnectors and regulate pricing as well. And if we don't have some deal that at the click of a finger replicates that with all the interconnector owners, we would have to negotiate with each interconnector owner one by one in order to import across Europe, which is, yes, you're pulling a face, I know, quite right. So, yes, the single market in energy has taken a while to develop in the EU, but it has very considerable potential for delivering on all three of the societal objectives. After Brexit, we will be the rule taker, not the rule maker. We're not going to be part of the market software. That's an expression. Says we obviously trade in markets financially, but the software turns those financial deals into physical flows across our interconnectors. It is actually, from the point of view of the transition to a low-carbon economy, it is quite an obvious point, I didn't bother to put it on the slide, that it's actually cheaper to use and build infrastructure wherever it's cheap to do so than to build it in an expensive place. So you wouldn't be about to be putting up, even small distributed generation in the middle of London, although there actually is one small power station in the city of London. It's a bit of a historical accident. Perhaps that's not quite the right word, but you know what I mean. Because it's just very expensive. So taking climate action on a regional basis doesn't require a degree in economics. I have to say that, and I mean this in all sincerity, that the EU has shown great leadership in pushing member states to pay attention to the environment, to water, and to energy. And they've had a huge influence, not just in terms of the directives that they've passed, of which there are a whole bunch, but also in actually changing attitude by member state governments. And also they have achieved a great degree of standardization and harmonization between countries that facilitate cross-border trade in energy. And the financial benefits of their leadership relate to investment in energy storage, and although the technology is still developing, nevertheless there are other ways in which we can collaborate in storage. One of which we were talking about before, which is using surplus renewable energy to create hydrogen and to store that in pipelines that are no longer being used. The hydrogen cars are very fashionable in Germany now. They love Germans love the latest technologies in cars. But I think that the other thing that has been hugely beneficial is that the regulators really pretty much regulate all in the same way. And regulators can actually do the same thing very differently, as we've seen in financial services. I won't bore you with all that. I do love storage as a subject. I've got rather too many points on it here, but we haven't really quite decided, the world needs to sit down and decide how it's going to class storage as an asset class and utilize it to achieve all three objectives. The regulators in the United States had a debate amongst themselves and said, well, we don't think it's actually generation and we don't think it's demand. We're going to class it as storage. I'm afraid that we have a number of course corrections to get more storage onto the system and to be used both in front of and behind customer meters. And we have to decide how we're going to help a market in storage to develop. We haven't got the legal and regulatory framework quite right, but we think we're kind of getting there. And storage pays, because we class it as both demand and generation, it has some double payments to make, double transmission charges, double balancing charges. So we can leapfrog over, you can leapfrog over all this based on kind of what we want. We don't think we've got sufficient incentives in the system for investors because they've got all sorts of potential revenue sources that aren't really clear. Anyway, I think I've left you with the other thing in our capacity market is that storage only qualifies for 4 years, a 4-year contract, which generation has 15 years. I'm not sure how that mistake occurred. It seems rather obvious. But it tells you the sort of I put all this down because I thought as lawyers you'd be interested in the sort of detail that we're getting in when we design auction rules, for example. And then there's another asset class which is new, and I mentioned, which we think is useful for integration of renewables into the system and to minimise the amount of redundant capacity you've got to carry. And that's demand-side response. And the technology is there. What we want to see is the development of the market. But system operators have an inherent bias to favour generation and supply-side solutions. In our capacity market, we require demand-side response to actually put up a bond, because in case it doesn't appear, it can't be relied on, which is rather put off investors one way and another. California actually has a rule that says that when you are actually going through the merit order, ordering plant onto the system, you use the demand side response first. Seems kind of an obvious point. I just sort of throw it in. Smart grids mean a different thing to everybody you talk to, so there are as many different meanings of smart grid as there are people to talk to one way and another. One of the most interesting one is the point which will link New Mexico, Texas, and California, that kind of part of the world. But it's really kind of all about using information systems data to make the whole system more efficient one way or another. But the message you take away from this is the last one, the digitization of the energy system will be a game changer and has huge potential, particularly in terms of driving down cost. I think you know more about carbon capture and storage than I do, because in Canada you actually have one of the world's most successful CCS projects next door to you, one way and another. The message that I bring from us is that I think we kind of rather regret that our government cancelled a pilot project, and now the idea is that we won't set up a kind of Olympic Delivery Authority type organisation to pilot it, because it has application not just for the electricity industry, but for large industrial users as well. So I'm going to sort of jump a bit now and get cut to the chase. I mean, all that every day in your careers, you will be thinking about what does it take to achieve investor confidence, and probably one of the best things that UK and Mexico did was to embed their climate action into legislation, and that was also set a framework for policy decisions that lasted from one administration to the next. Writing it down in legislation, so I met a lawyer in the Department of the Environment in Ontario who said, writing down some of this environmental policy is like nailing jello to the wall, and it can be quite a challenging task for a lawyer to nail this down into laws. But what I will leave you with right at the end is just a soundbite on green finance. We are pretty confident that finance is there, and it's very, very innovative. It's greener, it's collaborative, lots of different players playing together. And the focus is now, that's my penultimate point on this slide, is the creation of a pipeline of good sustainable projects that develop the skills and efficient competitive supply chains. And lawyers actually have a huge role to play in helping people to design projects that actually will attract investment, because they learn how to write the contracts that manage the risks. We're waiting for our government to issue a more detailed plan on how its policies will be implemented, but investor confidence obviously is greatly enhanced the further forward-looking the government implementation plans are. We also have budgets around this stuff, and people always like to know what the budget is going to be for that. Whether it's a budget for carbon emissions or it's a budget for the amount of money that's available to pay for contracts for differences or for supporting innovative technologies. So finally, before I just do a soundbite on green finance, how am I doing for time? David put the wind up me by email saying he would I'll stick to 45 minutes. I've got far too much to say in these slides. Quite right, it's concentrated my mind. I think as I said at the beginning, I mean, if you get bored easily, this is the space for you. You are, my team in electricity is usually working on something for the first and only time. If they get a chance to do it for the second time, they can get it right. If they get to the third time, they're kind of looking for some juniors to take it on and move on to the next thing. But by and large, even with the basic tools of laws, regulations, contracts, enforcement mechanisms, and dispute resolution, they're always actually unusual and different, and lawyers have to create that certainty even when the policies are not very clear or not very long term. I said that we have to deliver a suite of internally consistent and I should say enforcement efficient laws. We can't rely on long-winded dispute resolution that takes years and years in something that is basically operating in real time. We're invariably having to cope with the fact that each system is different. I mean, I did my power system operation training in Northern Ireland in 1987. I can tell you they don't do it like that now. But when I started work on England and Wales and the restructuring and privatisation, I discovered they operated the system, carried reserves totally differently, and everything that I knew was actually irrelevant. You have to learn it all over again. So the way in which Ontario operates its system is probably as much an accident of the history of the way it developed. And yours will be entirely different. So the thing that lawyers learn at university is the ability to learn fast. Well, you'll have that great confidence, especially in this institution, to know you can learn anything. And learning is very stimulating, and rising to a challenge is even more stimulating. And you'll have that satisfaction of knowing that you can actually do anything you want to. Somebody said to me, well, surely you've done all these market implementations all over the world and you must be running out of things to do. Well, they're always being redesigned because the needs that they're serving are always different. And I mean, that's the great thing about being a lawyer. I've been in the same firm since 1978, would you believe it? But I've not done the same thing in 2 days running. So it's a great profession. You can see my passion for it is as bright as it ever was. I suppose here are a few kind of legal tools that we are having to grapple with doing better and differently at the moment. Contracts for differences. You will probably have to do those in a way that are, although they're primarily hedges and financial, you'll probably be asked to do them in a way that reflects the physical properties of the plant, which is a bit unusual. But actually, there are some examples that we could help you with. Hybrid carbon taxes like our own, tradable allowances, different ways of trading them. Voluntary standards and codes that are nevertheless enforceable, even though they're voluntary. But you have to create a legal mechanism or find some trick that actually makes people not ever want to depart from a voluntary code. Dispute resolution that is so quick it never results in litigation. The Americans, I don't think, would like that so much, but there you go. Rules that spot the exercise of market power before it's happened. And effective, if you're trying if you're working with government, as I often do, efficient energy policy, it doesn't sort of dictate to people what they do, but sort of combines carrots and sticks. We haven't talked about cities. Cities have a strong role to play in the transition to a low carbon world. We could do public-private partnerships at city level, not national level, giving them much more autonomy, but making sure that they don't actually kind of go off the rails. How do you regulate cities? And one of my, I won't bore you with the niceties of coupling markets, but I'm a real fan of thinking about better long-term contracts, not contracts for 15 years, but contracts that will last for 60 years. Because that's the duration of some of this plant, of looking at how we deal with the unknown unknowns. If we have time at the end, or you can ask me a question about what ideas I have on that. I know the poster, lovely poster, whoever designed it, but it was very, very clever. I like that a lot. Said I would cover existing contracts. Existing contracts are extremely difficult in a world where you're moving into a market environment and you're putting in place a number of reforms, because they these existing contracts either inhibit what you can do if they're transmission contracts and you want open access to transmission, or they are long-term power purchase agreements, and it keeps that plant out of the market. I'm not going to be drawn into a question about your own PPAs, by the way, because I don't really know enough about them. I know they're quite contentious, but I have written some stuff for the World Bank on this, but there is actually quite a lot of very useful literature on the US experience of renegotiating contracts under PERPA. And you can actually deal with existing contracts through regulatory intervention as well. But all I would say is actually, the real thing is if you can build, in the new contracts you write, build in incentives to come to a negotiating table rather than leaving it to a dispute. And incentives also to reach agreement. There can be incentives, for example, about letting generating plant participate in some of the new markets, even though it might not naturally be able to do so, but it's an opportunity for them to add some competitive force and to earn some money there, like, for example, to participate in ancillary services markets. And again, if you want to ask me a question about Malaysia, I can do that. Anyway, to finish, this is a slide Caroline gave me some time ago, but it's a really powerful slide about the UK's green leadership. It's not just about the Great Climate Change Act in 2008, which was a first, but also keeping our 0.7% GDP aid target and a significant proportion on climate finance. Mandatory carbon and risk reporting in company annual reports, more transparent, push for more transparency, better management on that, and then our energy market reforms to achieve these policies. Finally, just a quick word about the City of London, which I hail from, and the green finance. There's a green finance initiative, which is really working hard to push green finance to become better known, help it scale up, have a broader reach, and also standardise, if you like, what you might call the definition of green, which is probably kind of moving to something about comparing the level of emissions reduction, the tons of emission reduction per $1,000 of investment. There are various definitions used by multilaterals and issuers and investors, and we think we need some consistency would actually help join everything up. Actually, the Green Investment Bank doesn't come from the City of London, I'm sorry to say. It's up in my hometown of Edinburgh. But it's a bank set up for green funding by the government, which was used, and they use it really for funding projects which are green. But they have kind of 70 people who will clean up a project so it is really, really green and more sustainable and more investable. And then they will crowd in on a ratio of about 5 to 1 the rest of the financing that's needed for it. And the last message from it is it's really been so successful that the private sector have said, well, actually, we think this is what we'd like to do, and so there's a substantial private share ownership, but it will be kept to its green mandate under that. Green bonds are extremely exciting and have risen exponentially. There are all sorts of different types of green bonds, but and appetite from investors, particularly investors that are looking for long-term investments like pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies. And these are, as you can see from the last bullet, a range of different sorts of green projects that have been funded with green bonds. I could take you into some more detail on that, but I don't think I have time. But you can see the sort of huge rise from one year to the next. I don't think that huge rise is sustainable. It was slow, but there is a lot of work on extending the reach and standardising and making the market more vibrant. I have to quote your great hero and most famous export, Mark Carney. I actually am on kissing terms with him through my role in the as Lord Mayor, but I could have kissed him for this one. We will be deepening and widening our inquiry into stranded assets, and the Financial Policy Committee will also consider this issue as part of its regular horizon scanning, work on financial stability risks. What that really means is we're going to look at everybody's exposure to carbon, and we expect that, and we have as a regulator of the banking sector, as well as a central bank. This is an important, very important issue. As the vast majority of reserves are unvulnerable if global temperature rises, or to be limited below 2 degrees. The tragedy of the horizons could cause market failure. There you go. There we are. So I think that I will probably leave it there. Be on Lord Mayor's show date. It's pouring with rain at the time.
So, would you be willing to take a couple of questions?
Yes, sure.
I should point out, while we're talking about it, that Mark Carney went to junior high school in Parkview, which is about 3 kilometers from here as the crow flies.
Oh, really?
Or as a bicycle ride.
Oh.
So, any questions or comments? Bruce?
Yes, you mentioned dispute resolution, avoiding litigation, arbitration, mediation. Is there some form of umpire or referee or regulator that can step in quickly?
Yes, you can use what we call expert determination on a fast basis on that. But one of the techniques that we used actually way back in 1990 was to put in a mechanism whereby an expert would go in and do a finding of fact. It was particularly to deal with system incidents with multiple causes. So if suddenly a part of the transmission system went out because there was a trip of some sort, because at that time some generator was pulsing and causing frequency harmonics on the system, and somebody and the system operator had ordered plant onto the system, perhaps over the limits, that you could actually go and get a finding of fact, and the finding of fact would actually be pretty much determinative of the reason, and therefore everybody would look at this and say, oh, if that's what happened, well, fine, then that means that I ought to pay, and so the system would go down. The problem would be dealt with over a sort of negotiation over money. And we set up a whole mechanism for these sorts of things to happen, and actually happened so rarely that eventually it was called the Electricity Arbitration Association. Eventually it folded up because it wasn't worth having a PA and somebody waiting for a phone call. We're not very disputatious actually in the UK. And engineer to engineer, they can get used to sorting things out. I remember talking to the Norwegians about how they dealt with disputes, and they said, a dispute? I said, well, if we have a problem, we usually go to the pub and have a beer and talk about it.
Well, that's so costly in Norway, it'll be the same. It's Randall.
Along the same lines, and as you might have answered the question of that last comment, is techniques. I think you had indicated that it's very advantageous to build in incentives into your agreements that get the parties to the negotiating table versus dispute resolution. I'm curious to know if the techniques besides a covenant to go to the pub, putting that aside, what would be some of the techniques that you would consider helpful, and obviously it's going to depend on the contract, would be helpful in order to force the parties or incent the parties to negotiate versus dispute?
Well, I have a couple of examples of that. One is a provision that says, usually what happens with these long-term contracts is that the financial equilibrium gets out of balance, and one party is doing worse than the other from a financial perspective. So if I took a power purchase agreement with a system of penalties for lack of availability, but the plant over time becomes more expensive to operate because it's going to be older, and penalties are really biting, and so the generator says it's not worth my while continuing with this contract. I'm just going to break it. If the provision that I have in mind would say, if that were to happen, the parties would sit down together to see whether to discuss whether there was a way of redressing the balance by, for example, an extension of the contract on lower price terms, which kind of looks like win-win for everybody. But you can, without binding the parties to any particular solution, put a menu of things in that they could discuss although it looks like an agreement to agree, which is no agreement, nevertheless, it kind of gives them
A menu of options.
yes, a carrot. The better answer, which I actually developed for on a 4-country transmission line project in West Africa, where all the local legal systems were fragile, put it that way, was to borrow a concept from French administrative law, which is the doctrine of imprévision, it's called in French, where if the balance of the contract turns out to be what the parties hadn't really anticipated, then they can invent something else to put in its place, and then you have to give probably an arbitrator the menu of what the options might look like, but you can base it on a financial model which you attach to the contract. It's a technique that we use in public finance initiative PPP contracts that says that, you know, my deal and David's deal look like this at the outset, and if we can adjust the contract so that it always returns to that deal, then we just make the adjustment. And if we can anticipate the unknowns more as an adjustment and as a source of dispute, then I think we do the world a favour, because in these long-term contracts, 90% of them get renegotiated anyway. There's a big paper that the World Bank have on their website about renegotiating concession agreements.
One other question. I think you had mentioned that you're a strong advocate of very long-term contracts, not 10, not 15, but I think you maybe mentioned 60 years or something.
No, I'm not an advocate of them, but some of them have to last that long because that's the asset life.
Right. Okay. All right. And as a result of that, and the reason why I was kind of asking the initial question is to build into that something that you can at least accommodate the parties' expectations over the course of the duration of that.
Yeah, I mean, so it's got provisions that we know you will renegotiate this contract, and when you do, this is how you go about it. And if it's about this, here's a menu of options. If it's about something else, this is it. And if it's about something we can't anticipate, then you'll have a good go at thinking about something, but at least as a backstop, you know actually what the equilibrium of this contract looks like. You're mixing economics and law at that point to at least give the expert or the arbitrator some frames of reference. And I did one on, there's a famous power station called Drax, and they turned a contract. They had a dispute on a contract, on a change of law clause on a contract for differences, and I mean, to be honest, between these 4 or however many walls we have here, it wasn't terribly clear what to do, and I was on an expert panel with another lawyer and an economist, and the economist sort of got bored with hearing the two of us chatting, and he said, well, I don't think what we're being asked to do by this clause is the right thing for the parties. So why don't we bring them in and say, actually, we don't think this is in your interest. Why don't you renegotiate this? And it took a day of arguing whether we had the power to suggest as experts that they do something that the contract didn't anticipate. And it's very difficult to get over the message that we actually didn't think the clause was well drafted, as we had the drafter in front of us, and I knew them very well. But actually, in the end, we said, well, look, just to concentrate your minds, we are minded to do something that neither of you will like because we think this is what we would have to do. So would you like us to defer our decision until you've had a chance to think about it? And they made us stay up all night. Eventually, about 5 in the morning, they said, okay, we're going to renegotiate this. So that concentrated my mind about writing these clauses in the future.
Other questions? Yes, Rod?
Currently in Canada, there's debate about electoral reform. And one of the arguments against first past the post is that it can produce greater instability because you have government policy of the day coming in, change in government, and that's dismantled. I was wondering if, in your experience, you see that in terms of energy policy. Is there a greater instability depending on the electoral system in place? Is there greater instability with first past the post?
Well, there are two questions in there because I'm no great expert on the advantages and disadvantages of first past the post and proportional representation. Because as you know, we don't have much experience of proportional representation one way or another. My sense is that energy policy is no more vulnerable than any other sort of policy to change of government. But it is very important because of the very large-scale investment for the climate change agenda we need to happen. And also, we also need to think longer term for our children and grandchildren as well. So I think we're in a world where policy needs to be, a bit like my long-term contracts, needs to be written on a more forward-looking basis, be longer-term policy to give more certainty. And I think that there is a huge advantage of embedding it in legislation to pass from one to the other. Whether the different method of, let me think about the question of the electoral process, the first past the post.
Think about Northern Europe, most of those places do not have first past the post, but they're the world leaders in green energy.
Yes, but that's because of the EU umbrella that they're under and the EU directives. Some of them.
The EU Parliament is essentially
Well, most of the
second fiddle to the bureaucracy. So
yes,
it's not
exactly.
administration.
Exactly. I mean, most of the energy policy starts in the European Commission.
But if you look at Northern Europe, in Denmark, for example, they are miles ahead of most places. In fact, I read the other day that Copenhagen is projecting that it will be net zero energy use by 2025. So, and that I think this past summer they had 3 straight days where they operated all energy solely on renewables. So, I'm not sure you can find a straight line between the electoral system and the policy. I think it's probably more rooted in culture. That's my view.
Yes, I'm trying to just think of an example from Mexico, where you kind of somehow feel that the Mexican administration gets elected on the basis of what the last administration didn't do, and whether the first past the post is more likely to deliver that kind of mindset or not. I think the short answer is I'm struggling to see a connection between the electoral system and energy policy. But I'm bound to think that energy policy is more important than anything else.
I'm going to ask the last question as a proxy for the students in the audience for a short answer. How on earth did you get in this field in the first place?
I don't think you'll believe the story, but it's true. I spent 3 years running our office in Bahrain in the 80s. When I came back, my partners had taken all my clients away from me. So I went in for a beauty parade to do the project documents for the Channel Tunnel, thinking I didn't know anything about tunnels, but anyway, got the job. So I became branded as a major projects lawyer. Some years before, I had advised the Electricity Council Pension Fund about an investment with General Electric on, would you believe it, storage batteries. And so I had a friend in there who was General Counsel, and he recommended me to his counterpart in Northern Ireland Electricity, because they were looking for a lawyer to help them rubbish an idea that the government had about building an independent power project in Northern Ireland. But needless to say, the utility there wanted to build its own power station very much, thank you very much, and didn't want a third party on its system. And they wanted me to explain to the government that if they had an independent power station on the system, the lights would go out. You'll be glad to know that I failed in that endeavour. I thought up a way of writing a power purchase agreement that would incentivise the IPP to follow the system operator's instructions, and also find a way of actually measuring availability, which you can't actually see when you walk into a power station. You can only measure it when the power station actually is called on to generate. So, but one evening in the pub, no, let me back up with that. That process involved my sitting in the control room in Belfast for the months of January, February and March, twice a week, learning how they operated the system. And I became the only lawyer in private practice who'd been trained in power system operations. But one evening in the pub, you know, we lawyers always ask one question too many. I said, so why is the government thinking about it? What's it going to cost? Oh, they said, we don't know. So what do you mean you don't know? I mean, I've been working on this for 3 months, you don't know what it's going to cost. And they said, no, you can't know what it's going to cost until you do the geology on the mine slope. This was a power station going to be fired by lignite. Can you imagine? The dirtiest fuel, brown coal, the dirtiest fuel on the planet, or certainly in Europe. 1987, can you imagine? Anyway, when they did the geology on the mine slope, it wasn't economic. And they did that rather rapidly, and then they'd been doing the geology, but they discovered it wasn't economic. So I became fated as having seen the government off. I got the job with advising the National Grid Company without a beauty parade, because I was the only lawyer in private practice who'd been trained in power system operations.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I would have to say we're particularly grateful because Dame Fiona has already spent all day with the Alberta government, came over from law school shortly after that meeting ended, and has a long evening ahead of her. So it was very, very gracious of you to do that, and we're deeply grateful. I'd also like to thank Caroline Saunders, who is the British Consul General for the Prairie Provinces based in Calgary, I think whose idea this was, and thank you for making it happen. We do appreciate it. And for Dame Fiona, we have a very small gift in a very large bag. So, there we are.
Well, thank you very much. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
With a University of Alberta Faculty of Law in gold lettering. Very, very good.
Thank you again.
It was a good gather.
I know.
Well,
Very good.